Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading the final chapter of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, and as always you should buy the original to support the original book, or something. Anyways, let's get on with it. Chapter 21. The low slanting rays of the morning sun glittered on the icy waters of the harbor as their sleighs halted near the stone quays. Greldick's ship rocked and strained at her hawsers, and a smaller ship nearby also waited with seeming impatience. Hedder stepped down and went over to speak with Chohag and Queen Selar. The three of them talked together quietly and seriously, drawing a kind of shell of privacy about them. Queen Islena had partially regained her composure and sat in her sleigh, straight-backed and with a fixed smile on her face. After Enheg had gone to speak with Mr. Wolf, Aunt Paul crossed the icy wharf and stopped near the sleigh of the Queen of Cherg. "If I were you, Islena," she said firmly, "I'd find another hobby. Your gifts in the arts of sorcery are limited, and it's a dangerous area for dabbling. Too many things can go wrong if you don't know what you're doing." The Queen stared at her mutely. "Oh," Aunt Paul said, "one other thing. It would be best, I think, if you broke off your connections with the bear cult. It's hardly proper for a queen to have dealings with her husband's political enemies." Islena's eyes widened. "Does Enheg know?" she asked in a stricken voice. "I wouldn't be surprised," Aunt Paul said. "He's much more clever than he looks, you know. You're walking very close to the edge of treason. You ought to have a few babies. They'd give you something useful to do with your time, and keep you out of trouble. That's only a suggestion, of course, but you might think it over. I've enjoyed our visit, dear. Thank you for your hospitality." And with that, she turned and walked away. Silk whistled softly. "That explains a few things," he said. "Explains what?" Garen asked. "The High Priest of Balar has been dabbling in Cherrick politics lately. He's obviously gone a bit further than I'd thought in penetrating the palace." "The Queen?" Garen asked, startled. "Islena's obsessed with the idea of magic," Silk said. "The bear cultists dabble in certain kinds of rituals that might look sort of mystical to someone as gullible as she is." He looked quickly towards where King Rodar was speaking with the other kings and Mr. Wolf. Then he drew in a deep breath. "Let's go talk to Poren," he said, and led the way across the wharf to where the tiny blonde Queen of Drasnia stood looking out at the icy sea. "Highness," Silk said deferentially. "Dear Keldar," she said, smiling at him. "Could you give some information to my uncle for me?" he asked. "Of course. It seems that Queen Islena's been a bit indiscreet," Silk said. "She's been involved with the bear cult here in Cherrick." "Oh dear," Poren said. "Does Enheg know?" "It's hard to say," Silk told her. "I doubt if he'd admit it if he did. Garen and I happened to hear Polgara tell her to stop it." "I hope that puts an end to it," Poren said. "If it went too far, Enheg would have to take steps. That could be tragic." "Polgara was quite firm," Silk said. "I think Islena will do as she was told. But advise my uncle. He likes to be kept aware of these kinds of things." "I'll tell him about it," she said. "You might also suggest that he keep his eyes on the local chapters of the cult in Bakhtor and Kotu," Silk suggested. "That kind of thing isn't usually isolated. It's been about 50 years since the last time the cult had to be suppressed." Queen Poren nodded gravely. "I'll see to it that he knows," she said. "I've got some of my own people planted in the bear cult. As soon as we get back to Bakhtor, I'll talk with them and see what's afoot." "Your people? Have you gone that far already?" Silk asked in a bantering tone. "You're maturing rapidly, my queen. It won't be long until you're as corrupt as the rest of us." "Bakhtor's full of intrigue, Keldar," the queen said primly. "It isn't just the bear cults, you know. Merchants from all over the world gather in our city, and at least half of them are spies. I have to protect myself, and my husband." "Does Rodar know what you're up to?" Silk said slyly. "Of course he does," she said. "He gave me my first dozen spies himself as a wedding present." "How typically Drasnian," Silk said. "It's only practical, after all," she said. "My husband's concerned with matters involving other kingdoms. I try to keep an eye on things at home. to leave his mind free for that kind of thing. My operations are a bit more modest than his, but I manage to stay aware of things." She looked at him slyly from beneath her eyelashes. "If you ever decide to come home to Baktor and settle down, I might just be able to find work for you." Silk laughed. "The world seems to be full of opportunities lately," he said. The queen looked at him seriously. "When are you coming home, Keldar?" she asked. "When will you stop being this vagabond Silk and come back where you belong? My husband misses you very much, and you could serve Drasnia more by becoming his chief advisor than by all this flitting about the world." Silk looked away, squinting into the bright, wintry sun. "Not just yet, Your Highness," he said. "Belgarath needs me too, and this is a very important thing we're doing just now. Besides, I'm not ready to settle down yet. The game is still entertaining. Perhaps someday, when we're all much older, it won't be anymore. Who knows?" She sighed. "I miss you too, Keldar," she said gently. "Poor, lonely little queen," Silk said half-mockingly. "You're impossible," she said, stamping her tiny foot. "One does one's best," he grinned. Hedar had embraced his father and mother and leaped across to the deck of the small ship King Enheg had provided him. "Belgarath," he called as the sailors slipped the stout ropes that bound the ship to the quay. "I'll meet you in 2 weeks at the ruins of Voakun." "We'll be there," Mr. Wolf replied. The sailors pushed the ship away from the quay and began to row out into the bay. Hedar stood on the deck, his long scalp lock flowing in the wind. He waved once, then turned to face the sea. A long plank was run down over the side of Captain Greldig's ship to the snow-covered stones. "Shall we go on board, Garion?" Silk said. They climbed the precarious plank and stepped out onto the deck. Give our daughters my love," Beric said to his wife. "I will, my lord," Merrill said in the same stiffly formal tone she always used with them. "Have you any other instructions?" "I won't be back for some time," Beric said. "Plant the south fields to oats this year, and let the west fields lie fallow. Do whatever you think best with the north fields, and don't move the cattle up to the high pastures until all the frost is out of the ground." "I'll be most careful of my husband's lands and herds," she said. "They're yours too," Beric said. "As my husband wishes." Beric sighed. "You never let it rest, do you, Merrill?" he said sadly. "My lord?" "Forget it." "Will my lord embrace me before he leaves?" she asked. "What's the point?" Beric said. He jumped across to the ship and immediately went below. Aunt Paul stopped on her way to the ship and looked gravely at Beric's wife. She looked as if she were about to say something. Then, without warning, she suddenly laughed. "Something amusing, Lady Pulgera?" Merrill asked. "Very amusing, Merrill," Aunt Paul said with a mysterious smile. "Might I be permitted to share it?" "Oh, you'll share it, Merrill," Aunt Paul promised. "But I wouldn't want to spoil it for you by telling you too soon." She laughed again and stepped onto the plank that led to the ship. Dernick offered his hand to steady her, and the two of them crossed to the deck. Mr. Wolf clasped hands with each of the kings in turn, and then nimbly crossed to the ship. He stood for a moment on the deck, looking at the ancient snow-covered city of Val Alorn, and the towering mountains of Cherrick rising behind. "Farewell, Belgarath," King Enheg called. Mr. Wolf nodded. "Don't forget about the minstrels," he said. "We won't," Enheg promised. "Good luck." Mr. Wolf grinned, and then walked forward toward the prow of Greldig's ship. Garion, on an impulse, followed him. There were questions which needed answers, and the old man would know it if anyone would. "Mr. Wolf," he said, and they both reached the high prow. "Yes, Garion." He was not sure where to start, so Garion approached the problem obliquely. "How did Aunt Paul do that to old Marche's eyes?" "The will and the word," Wolf said, his long cloak whipping about him in the stiff breeze. "It isn't difficult." "I don't understand," Garion said. "You simply will something to happen," the old man said, "and then speak the word. If your will's strong enough, it happens." "That's all there is to it?" Garion asked a little disappointed. "That's all," Wolf said. "Is the word a magic word?" Wolf laughed, looking out at the sun gleaming sharply on the winter sea. "No," he said. There aren't any magic words. Some people think so, but they're wrong. Groms use strange words, but that's not really necessary. Any word will do the job. It's the will that's important, not the word. The word's just a channel for the will. Could I do it? Garion asked hopefully. Wolf looked at him. I don't know, Garion, he said. I wasn't much older than you are the first time I did it. But I'd have been living with Alder for several years. That makes a difference, I suppose. What happened? My master wanted me to move a rock, Wolf said. He seemed to think that it was in his way. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. After a while, I got angry and I told it to move. It did. I was a little surprised, but my master didn't seem to think it was so unusual. You just said, move? That's all? Garion was incredulous. That's all, Wolf shrugged. It seemed so simple that I was surprised I hadn't thought of it before. At the time, I imagined that anybody could do it, but men have changed quite a bit since then. Maybe it isn't possible anymore. It's hard to say, really. I always thought that sorcery had to be done with long spells and strange signs and things like that, Garion said. Those are just the devices of tricksters and charlatans, Wolf said. They make a fine show and impress and frighten simple people, but spells and incantations have nothing to do with the real thing. It's all in the will. Focus the will and speak the word, and it happens. Sometimes a gesture of some sort helps, but it isn't really necessary. Your aunt always seems to want to gesture when she makes something happen. I've been trying to break her of that habit for hundreds of years now. Garion blinked. Hundreds of years? He gasped. How old is she? Older than she looks, Wolf said. It isn't polite to question about a lady's age, however. Garion felt a sudden and shocking emptiness. The worst of his fears had just been confirmed. Then she isn't really my aunt, is she? He asked sickly. What makes you say that? Wolf asked. She couldn't be, could she? I always thought she was my father's sister, but if she's hundreds and thousands of years old, it'd be impossible. You're much too fond of that word, Garion, Wolf said. When you get right down to it, nothing, or at least very little, is actually impossible. How could she be? My aunt, I mean. All right, Wolf said. Pulgera was not strictly speaking your father's sister. Her relationship to him is quite a bit more complex. She was the sister of his grandmother, his ultimate grandmother, if there is such a term, and of yours, of course. Then she'd be my great-aunt, Garion said with a faint spark of hope. It was something, at least. I don't know if I'd use that precise term around her, Wolf grinned. She might take offense. Why are you so concerned about all this? I was afraid that maybe she'd just said that she was my aunt, and that there wasn't really any connection between us at all, Garion said. I've been afraid of that for quite a while now. Why were you afraid? It's kind of hard to explain, Garion said. You see, I don't really know who I am or what I am. Silk says I'm not a Cendar, but Barrack says that I look like a Riven, but not exactly. I always thought I was a Cendar like Durnick, but I guess I'm not. I don't know anything about my parents or where they came from or anything like that. If Aunt Paula isn't related to me, then I don't have anybody in the world at all. I'm all alone, and that's a very bad thing. But now it's all right, isn't it? Wolf said. Your aunt is really your aunt. At least your blood and hers are the same. I'm glad you told me, Garion said. I've been worried about it. Greldick's sailors untied the hawsers and began to push the ship away from the quay. Mr. Wolf, Garion said as a strange thought occurred to him. Yes, Garion. Aunt Paula really is my aunt, or my great-aunt? Yes. And she's your daughter? I have to admit that she is, Wolf said wryly. I try to forget that sometimes, but I can't really deny it. Garion took a deep breath and plunged directly into it. If she's my aunt and you're her father, he said, wouldn't that sort of make you my grandfather? Wolf looked at him with a startled expression. Why, yes, he said, laughing suddenly. I suppose that in a way it does. I never thought of it exactly like that before. Garion's eyes suddenly filled with tears, and he impulsively embraced the old man. Grandfather, he said, trying the word out. Well, well, Wolf said, his own voice strangely thick. What a remarkable discovery. Awkwardly, he patted Garion's shoulder. They were both a little embarrassed by Garion's sudden display of affection, and they stood silently watching as Greldick's sailors rowed the ship out into the harbor. grandfather? Garion said after a while. Yes. What really happened to my mother and father? I mean, how did they die? Wolf's face became very bleak. There was a fire, he said shortly. A fire? Garion said weakly, his imagination lurching from the awful thought of the unspeakable pain. How did it happen? It's not very pleasant, Wolf said grimly. Are you really sure you want to know? I have to, grandfather, Garion said quietly. I have to know everything I can about them. I don't know why, but it's very important. Mr. Wolf sighed. Yes, Garion, he said. I guess it would be at that. All right, then. If you're old enough to ask the questions, you're old enough to hear the answers. He sat down on a sheltered bench out of the chilly wind. Come over here and sit down. He patted the bench beside him. Garion sat down and pulled his cloak around him. Let's see, Wolf said, scratching thoughtfully at his beard. Where do we start? He pondered for a moment. Your family's very old, Garion, he said finally. And like so many old families, it has a certain number of enemies. Enemies? Garion was startled. That particular idea hadn't occurred to him before. It's not uncommon, Wolf said. When we do something someone else doesn't like, they tend to hate us. The hatred builds up over the years until it turns into something almost like a religion. They hate not only us, but everything connected to us. Anyway, a long time ago, your father's enemies became so dangerous that your aunt and I decided the only way we could protect the family was to hide it. You aren't telling me everything, Garion said. No, Wolf said blandly. I'm not. I'm telling you as much as it's safe for you to know for right now. If you knew certain things, you'd act differently, and people would notice that. It's safer if you stay ordinary for a while longer. You mean ignorant, Garion accused. All right, ignorant then. Do you want to hear the story, or do you want to argue? I'm sorry, Garion said. It's all right, Wolf said, patting Garion's shoulder. Since your aunt and I are related to your family in a rather special way, we were naturally interested in your safety. That's why we hid your people. Can you actually hide a whole family? Garion asked. It's never been that big a family, Wolf said. It seems for one reason or another to be a single unbroken line. No cousins or uncles or that kind of thing. It's not all that hard to hide a man and his wife with a single child. We've been doing it for hundreds of years now. We've hidden them in Talnidra, Riva, Cherik, Drasnia, all kinds of places. They've lived simple lives, artisans mostly, sometimes ordinary peasants. The kind of people nobody would look twice at. Anyway, everything had gone well until about 20 years ago. We moved your father, Garion, from a place in Erendia to a little village in eastern Sandaria, about 60 leagues southeast of Doreen, up in the mountains. Garion was a stonecutter. Didn't I tell you that once before? Garion nodded. A long time ago, he said. You said you liked him and used to visit him once in a while. Was my mother a Sendar then? No, Wolf said. Ildera was an Algar, actually. The second daughter of a clan chief. Your aunt and I introduced her to Garion when they were about the right age. The usual sort of thing happened, and they got married. You were born a year or so afterward. When was the fire? Garion asked. I'm getting to that, Wolf said. One of the enemies of your family had been looking for your people for a long time. How long? Hundreds of years, actually. That means that he was a sorcerer too, doesn't it? Garion asked. I mean, only sorcerers live for that long, don't they? He had certain capabilities along those lines, Wolf admitted. Sorcerer is a misleading term, though. It's not the sort of thing we actually call ourselves. Other people do. But we don't exactly think of it that way. It's a convenient term for people who don't really understand what it's all about. Anyway, your aunt and I happened to be away when this enemy finally tracked down Garion and Ildera. He came to their house very early one morning, while they were still sleeping, and he sealed up the doors and windows, and then he set it on fire. I thought you said the house was made of stone. It was, Wolf said, but you can make stone burn if you really want to. The fire just has to be hotter, that's all. Garion and Ildera knew that there was no way they could get out of the burning house, but Garion managed to knock one of the stones out of the wall, and Ildera pushed you out through the hole. The one who had set the fire was waiting for that. He picked you up and started out of the village. We could never be sure exactly what he had in mind. Either he was going to kill you, or maybe he was going to keep you for some reason of his own. At any rate, that's when I got there. I put out the fire, but Garen and Eldera were already dead. Then I went after the one who'd stolen you. Did you kill him? Garen demanded fiercely. I try not to do any more than I have to, Wolf said. It disrupts the natural course of events too much. I had some other ideas at the time, much more unpleasant than killing. His eyes were icy. As it turned out, though, I never got the chance. He threw you at me. You were only a baby, and I had to try to catch you. It gave him time to get away. I left you with Polgara, and then I went looking for your enemy. I haven't been able to find him yet, though. I'm glad you haven't, Garen said. Wolf looked at him a little surprised. When I get older, I'm going to find him, Garen said, and I think I ought to be the one who pays him back for what he did, don't you? Wolf looked at him gravely. It could be dangerous, he said. I don't care. What's his name? I think that maybe I'd better wait a while before I tell you that, Wolf said. I don't want you jumping into something before you're ready. But you will tell me when the time comes. It's very important, Grandfather. Yes, Wolf said. I can see that. Do you promise? If you insist. And if I don't, I'm sure your aunt will. She feels the same way you do. Don't you? I'm much older, Wolf said. I see things a little differently. I'm not that old yet, Garen said. I won't be able to do the kind of things you do, so I'll have to settle for just killing him. He took up and began to pace back and forth, a rage boiling in him. I don't suppose I'll be able to talk you out of this, Wolf said, but I really think you're going to feel differently about it after it's over. Not very likely, Garen said, still pacing. We'll see, Wolf said. Thank you for telling me, Grandfather, Garen said. You'd have found out sooner or later anyway, the old man said, and it's better that I tell you than for you to get a distorted account from somebody else. You mean Aunt Poll? Polgara wouldn't deliberately lie to you, Wolf said, but she sees things in a much more personal way than I do. Sometimes that colors her perceptions. I try to take the long view of things. He laughed rather wryly. I suppose that's the only view I could take under the circumstances. Garen looked at the old man, whose white hair and beard seemed somehow luminous in the morning sun. What's it like to live forever, Grandfather? He asked. I don't know, Wolf said. I haven't lived forever. You know what I mean. The quality of life isn't much different, Wolf said. We all live as long as we need to. It just happened that I have something to do that's taken a very long time. He stood up abruptly. This conversation's taken a gloomy turn, he said. This thing that we're doing is very important, isn't it, Grandfather? Garen asked. It's the most important thing in the world right now, Wolf said. I'm afraid I'm not going to be very much help, Garen said. Wolf looked at him gravely for a moment, and then put one arm around his shoulders. I think you may be surprised about that before it's all over, Garen, he said. And then they turned and looked out over the prow of the ship at the snowy coast of Cherik sliding by on their right, as the sailors rowed the ship south toward Kamar and whatever lay beyond. Here ends Book 1 of the Belgariad. Book 2, Queen of Sorcery, will reveal Garian's own dangerous powers of sorcery, and more on his heritage, which underlies their quest.